Boy, am I rusty. I went home when I went home for vacation, or not went home, well, home and took my little vacation this past weekend. I brought my banjo with me to practice, but I forgot my picks. I left them here at the rectory, and so I couldn't practice. And so it's been like a couple of weeks since I practiced. And amazing how rusty you get if you don't keep practicing and things like that, especially if you're a beginner like I am. So, but anyways, I'm just kind of brushing off the rust, I guess you could say. So. Wait. I want them in a little bit more light here, so okie dokie. All right. So first off, I'd like to apologize that it's been a little while since I've done the Saint of the Week. Been busy. Obviously, I wasn't here last week to do that, and then week before I had a finance council to do, so which went long, and it kind of went into this time period. And the time before that, I was on vacation as well, and I was hoping to be able to do it while I was on vacation, but the cabin we were staying at when I was up in the mountains, the Wi-Fi went out on it, so I couldn't do it up there either. So anyway, so it's been almost like, I guess it's been almost a month since I've done it. So anyways, but glad to be back for those who are watching. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. So, okay. So the saint had a request by one of our parishioners. The saint that I'm going to talk about. Sorry, one of my buttons came loose on my shirt. The saint that I was asked to do, and I agree, this is a great saint. Their feast day was this past Sunday. We didn't celebrate it because it was coincided on a Sunday. So whenever a Sunday, by the way, All Sundays are actually whole days of obligation. That's why we go every Sunday. Um, but all Sundays are solemnities. Hold on a second. Someone shot me a text, and I need to respond to. So hold on a second. Okay. Um, anyways, so all Sundays are solemnities, and so whenever you have a solemnity that falls, like for example, like the 28th, so Saint Irenaeus' feast day is on June 28th. Um, Whenever that day falls, and it's obligatory memorial, so which means if it falls on that day, you're supposed to celebrate it, unless you have like a special occasion or something like that that can kind of trump it. Um, but whenever a Sunday comes around and it happens to fall on that particular feast day, because every Sunday is a solemnity, which in this case, this past Sunday was the 13th Sunday in ordinary time, which is a solemnity, automatically trumps that. Okay. Um, and different solemnities can trump others too. So it's kind of how it works. So quickly to go through the different types of days that we normally celebrate in a particular liturgical year. You have just the ordinary day, okay, whether it's ordinary time, okay, or you got Advent or Lent, okay, the days of those seasons, or days of Easter, okay. And then you have the next one is you got an optional memorial, okay, so you have an option to celebrate that saint's feast day if you want to. And optional memorials only take place during ordinary time, okay, whenever you're celebrating ordinary time. And so when it's an optional memorial, you can either do the mass for that saint or the mass of the day. Okay. Now, whenever it falls during Advent, normally you celebrate the Advent day. Okay, and you can do a commemoration. At least I think it's an Advent. I know for Lent for sure. During Lent, the Lenten day itself trumps any optional memorial, and so you don't do the saint's feast day. Although you can do a commemoration of that saint, so you can do a specific prayer during Mass and things like that. But the day is always that Lenten day. Um, I think during Advent, I'm trying to remember during Advent if you can do optional feast days or not, or optional memorials or not. I can't remember. But anyways, then you have optional, so it's option to do that, and then you have what they call obligatory memorials, which means obligatory means you're obligated to celebrate that saint's feast day. All right, um, and so when that day comes around, if there's not a higher feast day that trumps it, then you would celebrate that saint's feast day for that day. Okay, um, so those are called obligatory memorials, and um, and so you're supposed to celebrate that day, unless you, again, for a specific reason, you can celebrate something else, like a first communion or something like that, or a confirmation. Although a lot of times you can actually use the saint's feast day and the prayers for that day for those specific occasions if you want to. So, um, and then you have what we call feast days. So it's a next higher tier, or next higher level to celebrate. And whenever you celebrate a feast day, it automatically takes precedence, whether you're in Lent or Advent. It automatically takes precedence. And you always do a Gloria. So when during the Mass, you'll notice that whenever there's an actual feast day, okay, this not to be confused with just the feast day of a saint, okay, where we say it's the saint's feast day is such and such a date. That doesn't necessarily mean it's an actual feast, like that type of celebration. It just means that's the day we celebrate that saint's, you know, the anniversary of them becoming a saint. So an actual feast day in itself trumps anything else under it. And you would actually, and the way you know it's a saint's feast day is they always have the readings. They have their own proper readings. Okay, so one from the Old Testament or first reading, they have a responsorial psalm, and they have their own gospel. Okay, designated for that specific feast. So, like for example, tomorrow's the feast day of Saint Thomas the Apostle, and he has his own set of readings. So he has a first reading, and then which I think is probably from the Acts of the Apostles, is my guess. Um, and then you have a responsorial psalm, and you have a gospel. Okay, and I think the gospel is the calling of Saint Thomas, but I'm not sure. It's either that one or it's the Doubting Thomas. I think it's the Calling. I can't remember which one it is. I think it might be the Doubting Thomas. I don't know. I can't remember which one it is. But anyways, so it has its own set of readings. And you say a Gloria. So normally during normal or like ordinary time, like right now, or if tomorrow's a normal day, ordinary day, you would not do it. Even for a regular Saints feast day, like a memorial, an obligatory memorial, or an optional memorial, you would not say the Gloria, okay, during Mass. But on a feast day, you do. You say the Gloria, okay. Even if it was in Lent or an Advent, where you normally wouldn't do a Gloria, you would still do the Gloria if it's an actual feast day, okay. And then you have what we call solemnity. Solemnity, there of course there's not that many of them. Solemnities, you're actually you're required to celebrate not only to say the Gloria during the Mass, but you also say the Creed, the Nicene Creed that you normally do on a Sunday. So you treat it just like a Sunday, okay? Where you do all the parts of the Mass on a Sunday. And then not only that, if it falls during Lent, so like March 19th, for example, or March 25th sometimes, those are solemnities. You actually, if it fell on a Friday during Lent, you can actually eat meat on that day. Or normally we would fast from meat, right? Or abstain from meat. You would actually are allowed to eat meat. You can actually party it up on that day, which is pretty cool. So, so you celebrate with a great solemnity. That's what I call them, a solemnity. A very solemn occasion to celebrate. And so there's several of them throughout the year. Besides the holy days of obligation, okay, every holy day of obligation is solemnity automatically. But you have ones that are not holy days of obligation. So you have Solemnity of the Sacred Heart. Solemnity of Corpus Christi we always do on a Sunday normally, but actually traditionally it's done on a Thursday, okay? Whereas Sacred Heart is usually done on a Friday. You have Ascension as well, which is a holy day of obligation, and depending on what diocese you're in, which is usually done on a Thursday, but we always, in our diocese, we bumped it to a Sunday. You have Solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul, which we just celebrated it on Monday, which, again, it's not a holy day of obligation, but, that would be the day to celebrate as we showed June 29th. So you have several different different solemnities out there that are out there. So they're really beautiful to celebrate. And interesting too that all holy days of obligation, I can't remember if it's specifically on all solemnities, but I know all holy days of obligation, so those that don't fall on a Sunday, that the priest is required, the pastor, not just an associate, but the pastor is required to celebrate a Mass for the people. Okay, we call it pro popolo, that's what that means, for the people. So he's required. So every Sunday, if I'm traveling out of town and I'm not here, so for example, this past Sunday when I wasn't here, I was required to celebrate a Mass for you all, for the whole parish, and all the people in the territory. So not just the people in the parish, but also the people that are non-Catholics in the territory. I'm supposed to celebrate Mass for everybody, okay, on their behalf. And so I did. So myself and the priest I was with when I was up in North Carolina, we were in the hotel room. We celebrated Mass right in our hotel room, and we just pulled out a little table and we celebrated Mass together. And so that Mass, he did it for his parish, and I did it for my parish. So our parish is, since I have St. Francis. And so anyway, so it's really beautiful that prayers are being offered up all the time on our behalf. So someone sent me an email. Hold on a second. There was a question about this. Hold on a second. Let's see here. Sent it by email. If they says here, Feast Day of the Immaculate Conception, Light of December fall on Sunday, but we celebrate. Okay, so yeah, so whenever we have a holy day of obligation, it's normally a holy day of obligation. It's like the Immaculate Conception is normally a holy day of obligation in all dioceses across the United States. Whenever a holy day of obligation falls on a Sunday, okay, and also too, if it falls on a Monday, okay, for whatever reason, and again, the bishops can decide this. It's up to the bishops to decide. If it falls on a Sunday, it's always bumped to the next day, to the Monday. Okay, so which in this case, this past Immaculate Conception, December 8th, fell on a Sunday, and so because is it the second? I guess it would be the second, or maybe it's the first Sunday of Advent takes precedent. It's a higher solemnity than the Immaculate Conception. So because of that, that takes precedence for that Sunday. So we celebrated the first Sunday of Advent first, okay? And then, so what happens, but because it's our patronal feast, what we did was we bumped it to be celebrated the following Monday, so on December 9th, okay? And so, whenever that happens, whenever it's bumped, when the Holy Day of Obligation is bumped to the next day, because it's falling not on its proper day, so the next day, the 9th, it's never a Holy Day of Obligation, okay, to go. All right, you don't have to go. That Holy Day of Obligation is only attached to that specific day, which happens to be that Sunday, which we go anyway. So, okay. So that's what happens. It's bumped by a higher solemnity. Okay. Now, also too, if it normally falls, so say like it fell on a say Immaculate Conception falls on a Monday, for whatever reason, the bishops, the majority of the bishops in our country, have declared that if it falls on a Monday, it is not a Holy Day of Obligation as well. And I guess the reasoning is that I guess it's very difficult to make it to 2 days in a row as a Holy Day of Obligation. So that Sunday, of course, and then the following day, to make both days Holy Days of Obligation could be very difficult for people who work and things like that. So they don't make it a Holy Day obligation if it falls on an actual Monday. I think if it falls on a Saturday, generally speaking, we don't make it a Holy Day of Obligation either. I think that's removed as well. That's or dispensed as well. So I can't remember about that. But I think if it falls on a Saturday, it's not normally. But I have to look that back up. So, but anyways, okay. So that's the different levels of feast days out there. It's pretty neat, or different levels of things we celebrate, and it's pretty cool. But it's unfortunate because so many people do not actually celebrate. Like, yeah, we might go to mass on a specific solemnity or whatever. Holy Day of Obligation, like Immaculate Conception or the Assumption of Our Lady or whatever, or All Saints Day and stuff like that. People go to mass, but they never celebrate them at home. They don't like party it up. You're supposed to party it up, man. I mean, I'm like, why don't people do that? That's how we learn. That's what we teach our kids. The history behind those feast days, what we're actually celebrating. We need to celebrate them with great love, with great joy. And so bake a cake or have ice cream or throw a party or something with your family. But go out to a nice restaurant, do something. But do something to celebrate that day in honor of what we're celebrating. And so I really encourage people to do that. I know back at home, that's what we used to do at home with my parents and stuff. So anyways, it's really, really cool to do that. And I definitely encourage it for sure. So, okay. Hopefully in the future, I would like to, since we have a Marian parish, our parish is named after a lady in our honor, something in the future, hopefully this whole COVID thing will eventually be lifted in the near future. But I would love to actually celebrate one of Our Lady's great solemnities with greater devotion, maybe like have like a Marian procession or something like that around the church or something. That'd be pretty cool to do. With maybe a statue of her and have maybe like the Knights of Columbus, hold a special pedestal type thing on their shoulders, and they can, process around with her around the area, which would be pretty neat. So kind of like how, you've had Eucharistic processions in the past, maybe down to the historic chapel or something like that. We can do something with Our Lady, which would be really neat to do. So do it around the church or something like that, around the block would be pretty awesome. So. And it'd be in the wintertime if you did like for Immaculate Conception or maybe even like the Annunciation or something. But Immaculate Conception would be a good time to do it because it's cooler weather. So whereas if we did it for August 15th, it's pretty hot outside. Be sweating like crazy. So I would prefer to do it during maybe during the winter months or something like that. So anyways, so hopefully we can do that maybe this coming year, or this year, this Advent, maybe we can do that. So, but anyways, just to be able to celebrate it with great solemnity. And again, if anybody has any questions, please comment here where it says "say something." You can ask any questions. So, okay. All right, so the saint I picked for, actually someone asked me to pick, and I agree. I think it's a great, and it happens to fall during this week too. Like, and it fell on Sunday, even though we didn't celebrate it because it fell on a Sunday. So the saint I'd like to read or talk about is Saint Irenaeus, also known as Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, France. Okay, so he is a very incredible saint. I love him. He's one of my favorite saints. Um, he's considered one of the great church fathers of the early church. He is one of the, I think he's considered one of the four, they call him one of the four great early witnesses of the early church. Okay. There's, I think the four greats, like the four early history, call them the four witnesses or four main witnesses are, obviously besides the apostles themselves, you have St. Polycarp, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Justin Martyr, and St. Irenaeus. Those four right there, I believe, are considered the four witnesses. I have a book on them, and it's sitting over on my bookshelf, I believe. I might pull it out before I close it out just to double check it, but I think it's those four. Anyways, they were all alive in the first century or the second century. Okay, they all died right around that time or right there. So they're all alive in the second century. So they all knew people who knew or were very, very close to the apostles themselves. And so St. Ignatius of Antioch was, if I remember correctly, a disciple of Saint Peter, and he became the bishop of Antioch. Remember, Antioch was founded by Saint Peter himself, if I remember correctly. That particular church that he kind of started there, founded. Because remember, when the apostles traveled around, they started churches, not like separate churches, but like brought the church there or Christianity there, and so they established a church there. Okay, and so establishing an episcopal seat, so a bishop would reign there, and eventually would ordain priests and continue to spread the gospel. And so Saint Ignatius of Antioch, or became the bishop of Antioch, took over for Peter there. Okay, he was an early martyr, and we actually have his writings today. He has his writings. He was martyred. You have Saint Polycarp, who was a disciple of Saint John the Apostle. Okay, and he took over the church in Smyrna, which was a church founded by Saint John. John actually talks about the church of Smyrna in the Book of Revelation. Okay, so Saint Polycarp took over that church for Saint John. Okay, and then St. Justin Martyr was an apologist. He was a convert to Christianity. He was a philosopher, pagan philosopher, and he converted to Christianity. And he wasn't a priest or anything like that. He was just a layperson. But he was a great defender of the faith. He actually wrote to the Romans, wrote an apology, which not meaning like he's apologizing, but wrote like a defense of the Christian faith to the Romans, because the Romans were, people were thinking that the church, that the Christians were cannibals, that they were, because they're eating the body and blood of Christ, right? And so so he wrote an apology, a letter to explain like what the Christians actually believe, that it's not cannibalism, that they're, when cannibalism is eating a dead person, right? It's eating human flesh, or drinking blood or whatever of somebody who's dead, right? But so Justin Martyr's like, no, what we believe, what we eat is actually alive. It's Christ. He's alive. He's God, and He commanded us to do so. So it's not cannibalism. It's the resurrected body of Christ. And so anyways, and he goes on to describe what the Mass is like, and it's exactly what we do today. His writing, we still have his writings today. Okay, and he's writing in the mid 100s. It's amazing. He describes their liturgy, what their way of worship was, and it's exactly what we do in the Mass today. So it's incredible. And then you have Saint Irenaeus, and that's what we'll read today. So I better get going because it's already 24 minutes into this thing. So I get carried away, man, but I love it. I love talking about the faith. So okay, Saint Irenaeus. The amazing thing about Saint Irenaeus is we do pick up a lot about early church history, what was going on in the early church during his time, and because we actually still have his writings today too. Again, we do not have any of the original scriptures, the original books of the Bible. We do not have the originals. Okay, we have translations of them, which are very, very accurate. All you got to do is read the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay, and they have translations of those, right? And we have the actual Dead Sea Scrolls themselves, which dates back to the first century BC, okay, up into the first century AD. All right. And so we have those actual physical writings. Again, they're not originals of the Old Testament, but they're copies of the Old Testament. But the amazing thing is that they are exact. When you retranslate it, like we go back and look at the earliest writings we had before the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the earliest known writings that we have in the scriptures dated back to around, like actual like whole books, dated back to around 1000 AD, 1000 years after Christ. Okay, and so they prepared that translation of like the book of Isaiah, for example, with the Dead Sea Scrolls of Isaiah, and they are exactly the same. The translation is exactly the same. There's very, very, very little differences between them. The only thing would be my little grammatical errors. That's about it. But the translations are very, very accurate. And so interesting. But we do not have any of the originals of the New Testament, nor the Old Testament. Okay. But we do have the originals of these church fathers. Saint Irenaeus, for example, we actually have his writings, which is pretty cool. Which go back again to the first for the second century, so 100s AD, mid 100s into the late 100s. Okay, all right. Saint Irenaeus. The writings of Saint Irenaeus entitle him to a high place amongst the fathers of the church. So again, the church fathers, you hear these words, these phrases out there: the church fathers, the fathers of the church, the early Christian writers. That's basically a term given to these early bishops, priests, theologians, back in the first 500 years, 600 years of the early church. Okay, so you got the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth centuries. Okay, they're basically the great bishops who were basically reigning at those times. All right, writing about the faith, defending the faith. We have their writings, and so it's beautiful to see what they have to say about Christianity, about how the worship was done. So we call these guys the early church fathers. They were the ones who brought about the Bible in a sense of like talked about which ones were authentic, which ones weren't, and they kind of had general consensus of different ones, and they helped form ultimately the scriptures, the canon scriptures. And of course, it's from some of the early church fathers that we actually have. Kind of helped kind of form the Roman canon, or not the Roman canon, but the Bible as we know it today. So, as a matter of fact, you can go back if you read the early church fathers, because so many of them have been written. They've had so many writings. You can actually put together through all their writings. You can actually take all the scriptures that we have in the Bible. The whole entire Bible is quoted by the church fathers. They quote the scriptures all the time, and that you can actually take from their writings every single scripture verse that's out there in the Bible. So it's pretty cool. So that's what it means by early church fathers. These are the early writers, the early bishops, priests, theologians, and not even all of them were actually priests. Like I said, Justin Martyr wasn't a priest. Some were deacons, priests, bishops. Some were popes. So, but anyways, okay. So the writings of Saint Irenaeus entitle him to a high place amongst the fathers of the early church, or of the whole entire church. For they not only laid the foundations of Christian theology, but by exposing and refuting the errors of the Gnostics. So St. Irenaeus was writing against the Gnostics, okay, that particular belief. By the way, Gnosticism is basically, especially during this time period, was like, it was kind of a mixture of a little bit of Christianity, but also too mixed in with a bunch of other. So basically it's like going after knowledge for knowledge's sake, okay, that there's a secret knowledge out there. Might believe in a God, but nothing like Christian God or anything like that. There's good and there's evil, but searching for knowledge's sake, and that and so it kind of had a pagan atmosphere to it as well. But they were not interested in about Jesus Christ or about love or virtue or anything like that. So, and the Gnostics would a lot of times take Christianity and twist it and do their own thing with it, and come up with heretical ideas, false ideas. And try to write their own books and stuff. So, okay. So he would expose and refute the errors of the Gnostics, that they delivered the Catholic faith. So his writings delivered the Catholic faith from the real danger it ran of being leavened by the insidious doctrines of those heretics. Okay. Of his parentage, nothing is recorded. So we don't know who his parents were, or the exact year he was actually born, but they believe he was born around the year 125. AD. Okay, so that's real early, right? 125 AD. Remember, St. John the Evangelist dies around the year 100 AD. So this is only 25 years after the death of the last apostle. So this is really early, okay? In one of those maritime provinces, he was born around in one of the maritime provinces of Asia Minor. So one of the places where they had probably one of the different ports or something of Asia Minor. And it says, where the memory of the apostles was still cherished and where Christians were numerous. Okay. So remember, 25 years after the death of the last apostle is when he's born. So I mean, think about it. All right. Um, it's like right now, like, I'm 36 years old. Okay. Um, when I was born, so when I was 25, for example, I knew people who knew um, my grandfather. Okay. My grandfather passed away, um, you know, back when I was, earlier in my life, right? But it's like, say, like my nieces and nephews who were born after he died, you know, I knew him growing up, right? As a matter of fact, he died when I was, how old was I? Well, I was right around, well, I was about 23, 24. So, okay, so right around the same time, okay? So my nieces and nephews, some of my nieces have never met him before, right? But they can ask me. I remember him. I've talked to him, right? I played cards with him. I used to, he taught me how to drive a tractor, right? So my nieces and nephews who'd never met him before could come up and ask me and talk to me about, hey, what was grandfather like? What was my grandpa like? And and so and so I can tell them because I knew him, right? It's the same thing like someone like Irenaeus who, like, he knew people who knew the apostles. Okay. So it's the same thing. Like, why wouldn't I trust this guy, right? Because he knew people who knew the apostles, who walked and talked with the apostles, right? And so these guys would know, these early church fathers would know um, what the apostles taught, which is beautiful. Um, so yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. He received what must have been an exceptionally liberal education, for it gave him, liberal being, like the liberal arts. Okay. So studying of like literature, um, philosophy, theology, all that kind of stuff. Okay. For it gave him a thorough knowledge of the text of the Holy Scriptures and a good general acquaintance with Greek philosophy and literature. Okay. Moreover, he had the inestimable privilege of sitting at the feet of men who had known the apostles or their immediate disciples. Sorry. Of these, the one who influenced him the most. So again, he sat at the feet of men who had known the apostles or their immediate disciples. Remember, like I was saying, I knew my grandfather, but so my nieces and nephews never did, right? They never met, they weren't born then. But they could talk to me about him, right? It's the same thing with St. Irenaeus. He could talk to people who walked and talked with the apostles. Okay. It says, of these people who knew the apostles, of these, the one who influenced him the most was St. Polycarp. Remember I was saying about St. Polycarp earlier? St. Polycarp was martyred early in church. He was martyred, I'm trying to think when he was martyred. St. Ignatius of Antioch was martyred around 110, I think, AD. Polycarp was later. Okay. So anyway, so St. Polycarp, well, here, let me go on and read, okay? So of these, the one who influenced the most was St. Polycarp. So profound indeed was the impression made upon him by the holy bishop of Smyrna. So remember, I was saying St. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, who was founded by St. John the Apostle, right? So he became the bishop after St. John, right? Or took over, right? A bishop of Smyrna throughout his habit. Okay, so indeed was the impression made upon him by the holy bishop of Smyrna that throughout his life, and that, hold on a second, let me read that again. So profound indeed was the impression that St. Polycarp made upon him that throughout his afterlife, as he told a friend, he could recall every detail of St. Polycarp's appearance, the sound of his voice, and the very words he used when describing his intercourse or his discussions with the evangelist St. John. So remember, St. Polycarp was a disciple of St. John the Evangelist himself. Okay, and so St. Polycarp used to talk to St. Irenaeus, who was, again, St. Irenaeus was his disciple, talk to him about talking to St. John and learning under St. John. and the others who had seen the Lord. Okay, so St. Polycarp knew more than just St. John. He knew some of the other apostles, okay, and other disciples who knew Jesus. Okay, and so St. Irenaeus knew some of these guys, right, which is pretty cool. All right. And so, and others who had seen the Lord, and when he was expounding the doctrine he had learned from them. St. Gregory of Tours, okay, he was a bishop later on, a little bit later on, asserts that it was St. Polycarp who sent St. Irenaeus as a missionary to Gaul, all right, so France area, Spain area, okay, to Gaul, but there is no evidence to support this statement. So we don't really know if St. Irenaeus was sent by St. Polycarp himself, or how exactly we know how St. Irenaeus ended up in Lyon, France, okay, in the Gaul area. But that's what St. Gregory of Tours. So again, St. Gregory of Tours is writing in, hold on a second, St. Gregory of Tours. Let me look him up really fast, because again, this is history. We need to know this stuff. St. Gregory of Tours. St. Gregory of Tours, so he was in the 500s, okay? So he was in the 500s, and he lived in France, and he taught in France, because Tours is in France, right? And so again, you think about this. All right, so St. Irenaeus was alive in the 100s. St. Gregory of Tours was in the 500s. So again, so you're looking at, 300 years later, 400 years later. But again, stories are passed on, right? Stories are passed on. So St. Gregory of Tours must have heard this story that St. Polycarp sent St. Irenaeus to Lyon, okay? Whether that's true or not, again, we don't have any actual physical evidence that supports that fact, but that's the story that was passed on to Gregory of Tours. There's no reason to deny that. Again, just like we believe stuff that happened we got, well, we do have physical evidence, but, when people tell us, about the early, about our country back in the 1600s, right? We trust that those histories are true, right? Because people wrote about them or passed on stories about that, right? So there's no reason to do the same thing with St. Gregory, but again, we don't have any physical evidence of that. Commercial relations had existed from early times between the ports of Asia Minor and Marseille, and in the 2nd century of our era. Levantine traders were regularly conveying their wares up the Rhone River, as far as Lyon, which became, in consequence, the chief mart of Western Europe and the most populous city in Gaul. All right, so you gotta remember, Lyon was a Roman city founded by a Roman general, if I remember correctly, because I actually went to Lyon back in France, in France back in March, and our tour guide told us that Lyon. Originally, the name of it was Lugdunum, I think was the name of the town in the Roman city at first, and it eventually became known as Lyon. It's a Roman city, so it's an ancient Roman city. Okay, all right, and it's cool because there's two rivers, or there's a river. I think the river splits around it. Remember, is it two rivers? Yeah, it's two rivers. The Rhone and another river split around Lyon, so it's actually kind of like an island. Or the old city is an island. Now it's much bigger. So, but anyways, it was a perfect place to build a city because ships could come up out the rivers. So it became a chief martyr of Western Europe. All right. In the train of the Asiatics, many of whom settled in Lyon, there came priests and missionaries who brought the gospel to the pagan Gauls and founded a vigorous local church. To this church of Lyon, Irenaeus came to serve as a priest under its first bishop. So the first bishop of Lyon his name was Saint Pontius, who's a saint, and he was also a martyr. Okay, and he came from Asia Minor, like Irenaeus himself. To it, he was to remain permanently attached. And so again, so Saint Irenaeus came with Saint Pontius, who was the first bishop of Lyon. Saint Irenaeus became the second bishop of Lyon, if I remember correctly. So he took over, but St. Pontius was actually martyred. Okay, so he came along with him. So the high opinion held of him by his brother clergy was evident in the year 177, when he was dispatched on a somewhat delicate mission to Rome. It was after the outbreak of the terrible persecution, which is dealt with at some length under June 2nd in this volume. Okay, so June 2nd. Look at what happened on June 2nd. which martyrs those were, or persecution. June 2nd, here we go. Here we go. Saint Pontius's feast day and his companions. So he was martyred for the first bishop of Lyon, Saint Pontius, and there were some companions who were martyred around the year 177 AD. So their feast day is June 2nd. Okay. All right. So it says, so the high opinion held of him by his brother clergy was evident in the year 177, which was when that martyrdom took place. When he was dispatched on a somewhat delicate mission to Rome, it was after the outbreak of the terrible persecution in 177, which was dealt which is again dealt if you were to read this June 2nd, his feast day of Saint Pontius. Okay. And already some leaders of the Church of Lyon were in prison. Okay, so their captivity, however, did not prevent them from continuing to take a deep interest in their fellow Christians in Asia Minor. Conscious of the sympathetic hearing to which they were entitled as confessors in imminent peril of death, they sent to Pope Saint Eleutherius. Okay, so he was Pope. So Saint Eleutherius was Pope during this time, by the hands of Saint Irenaeus, who was described by the church historian Eusebius as a most religious and most orthodox letter in which they appealed to him, in the interest of the peace and unity of the church, to deal leniently with their Montanist brethren in Phrygia. Okay, so Montanism was a heresy. I'm trying to remember what it meant. Hold on a second. Sorry, guys. And I'm going out a little bit here, but it's good to know this stuff. Montanism. What the heck is it? Okay, so basically it believed that revelations were continued to be held by after. So we believe, so the church officially teaches that the revelations, like basically like divine revelation, okay, so what's been divinely revealed by Christ, all right, our faith, what we hold as our faith, that stopped with the death of the last apostle, okay, with the death of the last apostle. All right, so once the death of John the Evangelist, once he died, divine revelation stopped, or at least as far as like doctrine being given out and things like that. That ended with the death of the last apostle. All right, and so everything that needed to be revealed was revealed. Okay. Now, of course, when doctrine comes out today, like when it's basically a further explanation. It's not new doctrine, like something brand new being made up. No. Basically, something else is being explained, or something's come to light, and so a better explanation of something of doctrines in the past, and so that's what's going on. Okay, so Montanism believed that divine revelation continued to take place, and new prophecies were coming out, all kind of stuff. So new revelations, and it's false. Okay, that was a false heresy. Okay, all right. So they commanded that the bearer of the letter to his notice as a priest, filled with the zeal for the testament of Christ, and as one who was, as his name implied, a lover of peace. So basically, say they sent Irenaeus with this letter to this pope. So these bishops some were in prison, okay, but Saint Irenaeus was a representative, and they sent him back to Rome on this mission, carrying this letter to the pope at the time. Okay, this mission, entailing as it did absence from Lyon, explains how it was that Irenaeus was not called upon to share the martyrdom of Saint Pontius. So basically, okay, giving a little context here. So Saint Irenaeus was asked to go to Rome bearing this letter, okay, from Pontius and some other bishops in the area and priests, okay, carrying this letter to the Holy Father. So that's why Saint Irenaeus was not martyred with these guys, because he was a priest given this task to carry his letter back to the Holy Father. That talked about Montanism, it talked about other different things, okay? It basically probably explaining maybe they'd stayed at the church in Lyon at the time, in that area, okay? And so this mission, entailing as it did absence from Lyon, explains how it was that Irenaeus was not called upon to share the martyrdom of St. Pontius, and his fellow sufferers, and does not seem to have witnessed it. How long he remained in Rome, we do not know, but when he returned to Lyon, it was to occupy its vacant episcopal see. So basically, he was sent back from Rome back to Lyon to take over as the Bishop of Lyon. Okay. By that time, the persecution in Lyon was over. In the 20 or more years of his episcopate or his bishopry were years of relative peace. Information about his activities is scanty, but it is clear that in addition to his purely pastoral duties, he did much to evangelize the neighboring lands. He is said to have sent Saints Felix, Fortunatus, and Achilles as missionaries to Valence, and Saints Ferrutius and Ferolius to Besancon. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. A small indication of the extent to which he identified himself with his flock is supplied by the fact that he habitually spoke the Celtic language instead of his native Greek. So interesting. So Gaul in that area, that spoke some form of Celtic language in that area. So instead of speaking Greek, he would speak Greek, but he also spoke the native language. It was the spread of Gnosticism in Gaul and the ravages it was making amongst the Christians of his diocese that inspired him to undertake the task of exposing its errors. He began by mastering its tenets, no easy matter, since each Gnostic master was inclined to introduce a variation of his own. So basically, there are different forms of Gnosticism. Okay, so each master of Gnosticism kind of had their own way of describing it and talking about it and teaching it. And so Irenaeus learned their ways of how they taught, and he basically was able to battle each one individually with great skill. So fortunately for Irenaeus, he was, as Tertullian, who was also an early Christian writer, tells us, a curious explorer of all kinds of learning. So Irenaeus loved to learn, okay? He loved knowledge, but he put God first, how it can serve God, right? And he found the work not uncongenial. He then produced a treatise in 5 books in which he sets forth fully the inner doctrines of the various Gnostic sects, the different groups, and afterwards contrasts them with the teaching of the apostles and the texts of Holy Scripture. A good example of his method is provided by his treatment of the Gnostic doctrine that the visible world has been created, preserved, and governed by angelic beings and not by God. So that was a Gnostic heresy, that the visible world had been created and preserved and governed by angelic beings and not God. Okay, so that's a heresy. We believe God created everything, not the angels. Okay. So he provided treatment of the Gnostic doctrine that the visible world has been created, deserved, and governed by angelic beings and not by God, who remains unconnected with it, aloof, indifferent, and incapable of activity in the pleroma, or the invisible spiritual world. So basically, the Gnostics believed that those who believe in that belief that the angels created everything, that God could care less, had no idea that the angels created the world. So again, that's just this Gnostic belief. Irenaeus states the theory, develops it to its logical conclusion, and by an effective reduction, deducting things, proceeds to demonstrate its fallacy. The true Christian doctrine of the close relationship between God and the world he has created, Irenaeus sets forth in the following terms. The Father is above all, and he is the head of Christ. But the Word is through all things, and he is himself the head of the church, whilst the Spirit is in all of us. And his is the living water which the Lord gave to those who believe in him and love him and know that there is one Father above all things, and through all things and in all things. Concerned as he is to convert rather than to confound, Irenaeus writes with studied moderation and courtesy, but now and then humorous comments escape him. Okay, so he also had a side of humor to him. Referring, for instance, to the attitude of the newly initiated, he says, so those who newly came into the church, he says, as soon as a man has been won over to their way of salvation, he becomes so puffed up with conceit and self-importance that he imagines himself to be no longer in heaven or on earth, but to have already passed into the pleroma. And with the majestic air of a cock, he grows strutting about, as if he had already embraced his angel. So Irenaeus was firmly convinced that a great part of the attractiveness of Gnosticism lay in the veil of secrecy with which it surrounded itself, and he was determined to strip the fox, as he expressed it. So basically, so again, remember I was saying Gnosticism believed in a form of secrecy, that there's a secret knowledge out there, and that's what we're trying to get. Everybody who believed in Gnosticism believed that there was a secret knowledge, and the more knowledge you knew, you got to know the secret stuff, right? And so it's only reserved for people who wanted to go deeper in their knowledge of different things. And Saint Irenaeus was exposing all this falsity and things like that. So people who newly came into the church, who were trying to seek knowledge of God and the theology and things like that, it was easy to fall into Gnosticism, because Gnostics are like, well, you got to keep studying, and there's more to know than what you already know, and so we kind of lead people astray and fall off into the deep end, and they would make up their own stuff that kind of would twist Christianity and stuff like that. So the event proved him to have been right. His work, written in Greek but quickly translated into Latin, was widely circulated and succeeded in dealing to second century Gnosticism what appears to have been its death blow. At any rate, from that time onwards, it ceased to offer a serious menace to the Catholic faith. So basically, St. Irenaeus was so good in his philosophy and logic, being able to argue, being able to logically explain things, was able to rip apart Gnostic beliefs, that he was so good at refuting those teachings, basically showing how they're false, that they don't make sense, that it wasn't really a threat anymore to that area of the church in France and that Gaul area. So he was that good. 13 or 14 years after his mission to Pope Eleutherius, so this is 13 years after he became bishop, I guess, Saint Irenaeus again acted as mediator between a pope and a body of Christians in Asia Minor. Because the, hold on, what's this, Quarto Decimans? I'm not sure how I pronounce that. I guess as a group of people, a group of believers, refused to keep Easter in accordance with the Western use. They had been excommunicated by Victor III, I guess Pope Victor III, and there was in consequence a real danger of schism. So I guess there was a group of people, Christians, who refused to keep Easter on its original feast day, or the feast day that the Western Church, so Rome, had established. Okay, and so they refused to celebrate Easter on that traditional day. Okay, and so they were threatening to leave the church or go into schism. Okay, and they had even been excommunicated by the Pope Victor III at the time. So St. Irenaeus is trying to basically like, hey, we don't need to have a schism here. Let's try to find peace here, figure something out, right? So St. Irenaeus intervened on their behalf. In a singular, beautiful letter addressed to the Pope, he pleaded with him to raise the excommunication or the ban, pointing out that they were only following their old tradition. So this group of people were just basically following the tradition that's passed on to them, okay? And that the Rome had basically later on, they decided to kind of establish Easter I'm trying to think, if it's like the Sunday that follows. I'm trying to remember how it falls after the spring equinox. It moves around. Obviously, Easter moves around throughout the year, each year after year, and it has to do with the spring equinox and the Sunday that follows, like the full moon or something. I can't remember exactly all it is, but anyways, it moves around. And so what these guys basically followed a different tradition that was passed on to them. So they were just following what was taught to them. Okay. So St. Irenaeus is trying to tell the Pope, like, look, they're just following what was taught to them. Okay. And that a difference of opinion on that very point had not prevented Pope Anicetus and St. Polycarp from remaining in communion. So basically, it wasn't a contention or anything like that, a problem with the previous popes, and even St. Polycarp himself they didn't question when they celebrated Easter, kind of a thing. So the outcome of its representations was restoration of good relations between these two groups, this group and Rome, and peace which proved to be permanent. After the Council of Nicaea in 325, so a whole 100-something years later, this group, the Quarto Decimans, voluntarily conformed to the Roman usage without any pressure from the Holy See. So eventually this group of Christians who follow that old tradition eventually end up conforming themselves and celebrating Easter on that traditional day that Rome had established. Okay. The date of the death of St. Irenaeus is not exactly known either. It is usually assigned approximately to around the year 202 or 203. According to a later tradition, he suffered martyrdom, but this is highly improbable. So there is a tradition that he suffered martyrdom, but most historians and theologians say that he probably did not actually die a martyr. His treatise, the treatise against the Gnostics, has come down to us entire in its Latin verse. So basically, like I was saying, his writings that he wrote, his letters against the Gnostics that he wrote back in the 100s, late 100s AD, are still in existence. We have them today. That's incredible, right? It's incredible. So its entire Latin version is available to us today. And there's also an Armenian translation of an exposition of apostolic preaching that has been comparatively lately been discovered as well. So there's actually an Armenian translation of his apostolic preaching or writings about apostolic preaching that actually was more recently discovered. Now, this book was written back in like the 50s or 60s. When was this written? Hold on a second. This particular translation goes back to 1962. All right, so a recent, probably early 60 or early 1900s. They found another translation of some more of his teachings, okay, about apostolic preaching. Though the rest of his writings have perished, in these two works alone may be found all the elements of a complete system of Christian theology. So a whole system of what Christians believed at the time of his time in the 170s, 180s, 190s. Again, only 100 years after the death of the apostles. It's incredible that we actually have those writings today, right? The bodily remains of St. Irenaeus, as we learn from St. Gregory of Tours, were buried in a crypt under the altar of what was then called the Church of St. John, right? But what was later known by the same name of Irenaeus himself. This tomb or shrine was destroyed by the Calvinists. This is very unfortunate. This tomb or shrine was destroyed by the Calvinists in 1562, and all trace of his relics seem to have perished. It is remarkable that though the feast of St. Irenaeus has long been observed in the East, which would have been on August 23rd, so the Eastern Church celebrates his feast on August 23rd, it has been general in the Western Church only since 1922. Okay. Okay. So the feast day of St. Irenaeus being celebrated on June 28th is more recent. That really started in 1922, but the Eastern Church has been celebrating his feast day since August 23rd. It's a long time. Okay. Well, anyways, so we don't really know a whole lot about his personal life and his early life, or even how he died exactly. But and even his remains tradition has his remains were taken by the Calvinists. The Calvinists came in 1562. They basically came through the area of Lyon. And they did a lot of damage to a lot of the churches. As a matter of fact, when I was in Lyon, you could actually see they basically cut off the heads of all the statues that were in the churches, destroyed a lot of beautiful artwork because they didn't believe in statues, right? They thought they were gods. We thought they were graven images and stuff. So, so a lot of that damage is still there today, but they've dug up his remains and threw them in the river. That's the tradition, threw them in the river. So his relics were thrown into the river, which is very unfortunate. But I was actually in that church where he was buried, so which is pretty cool. But anyways, so that's St. Irenaeus. Again, not a whole lot about his personal life because we don't really have any actual biography of him. But that's what's been passed down through history and stuff to us today. But anyways, so that's pretty cool. So one thing I want to close with as far as his life was that in those writings, with Gnostic writings, you might have heard me talk about this a little bit before. I might have preached a little bit about it, and those who maybe were in my RCIA class and some other classes about the Bible and stuff that I gave about the Bible and how its beginnings, its origin, that we actually, in the writings of St. Irenaeus and his letters against these Gnostics, writing against these Gnostics, he actually talks about some of the false gospels. So you might have heard about there's a gospel called the Gospel of Judas, which dates back to the 2nd century. And that was hot news back like 10 years ago, even before that a little bit. But you might remember a movie came out called The Da Vinci Code, and there was a book that also was called written by that, or a book came out first and then the movie came out later, starring Tom Hanks. And then it came out with another one like Angels and Demons or something like that. It came after that, or a sequel. Well, that's based off of the writings of the Gospel of Judas. Okay, so this Gospel of Judas was recently discovered, like in the sands of Egypt or something like that. So archaeologists discovered this ancient book called the Gospel of Judas. All right, and it dates back to the 2nd century, and it basically talks about how Judas was really the good guy. That he and Jesus kind of huddled together basically and like figured out how that Judas is going to have to betray him and set up this whole betrayal, so that he could be crucified. And so Judas was actually like a really good guy, and he and Jesus kind of helped plan out his crucifixion. So he'd have to betray him. So basically, like Judas has to do this in order for Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection could take place. And so like Jesus and Judas plan this all out. And so Judas is the good guy, and and so anyways, and so it paints Judas in a very, very good light, and the other apostles not as good a light as much. And there's a bunch of other crazy teachings in there, that are not Christian. And so people like archaeologists and scientists and people today, or when it was discovered recently, they're like, oh, this completely changes Christianity. Christianity isn't what we thought it was, and that Jesus might have been married, as a married person, and had a wife, maybe kids, all this kind of nonsense stuff. And so people are like, well, what is this gospel? Why isn't it in the Bible? And was it a cover up and all this kind of stuff? And so they're like, we've never heard of this gospel. Well, yes, we have. The early church has always known about it. St. Irenaeus writes about it in his writings. He talks about the Gospel of Judas. He actually says in his writings, the Gospel of Judas was a Gnostic gospel. It's false. It's folly. It's filled with false doctrines that are purposely written to lead Christians, especially new Christians, astray. That they specifically wrote this gospel to mock Christianity and Christian beliefs, and to try to lead early Christians away from the church. And so he condemns it. He says, do not believe it, because it wasn't written by Judas. It wasn't written by any of the apostles. It was written by these false Gnostic guys. And so the church has always known about the Gospel of Judas. We just didn't have the copy. Well, the copy was all of a sudden discovered in, again, some place in the Middle East, or over there in the Eastern area, Middle Asia Minor, and like the new media is like, oh yeah, this is all new stuff, and so we can no, it's all false stuff. So Saint Irenaeus writes about it. So it's really cool. And again, remember, Saint Irenaeus was a disciple of Saint Polycarp, who was a disciple of Saint John the Evangelist himself, which is pretty awesome. It's like Saint John being like the grandfather, and Saint Irenaeus being like the grandson. I mean, it's just like that close. And to again, it's just amazing to be able to talk with somebody who knew one of the apostles, who learned from the apostles themselves. It's just pretty awesome. And it wasn't just Saint Polycarp alone. He walked and talked with other disciples of some of the apostles themselves too. So it's pretty awesome to like read about that and to think about that. So anyways, so he's a great saint of the church. The second bishop of Lyon, he helped evangelize the whole area of Gaul. Was a great theologian. Helped form doctrine and stuff like that. Explained the teachings, divine revelation, and teachings of Christ and the apostles to us, passing it along. So anyways, great saint that we have today. See, David Costa said so. I guess I'll have to watch this later after it's posted. Okay. I guess it wasn't. This hasn't been posted on our website. I forgot to ask Miss Susan, to post it, but so I sent it to her, but I think I forgot to tell her about it. So it's been a little while. A lot of things have been forgotten, so I forgot about it myself. So, anyways, but Saint Irenaeus is an awesome guy. Let me be right back. Hold on just a second. All right, so remember that book I was mentioning about the four witnesses at the beginning of this talk? Well, here it is, the four witnesses. And so, yeah, oh, okay, it wasn't, I was wrong. It wasn't St. Polycarp, it's St. Clement of Rome, St. Ignatius of Antioch, St. Justin Martyr, and St. Irenaeus of Lyon. So these are their writings, okay? And let's see, let me see, St. Irenaeus here's. Yeah, so it actually has quotes from his writings in here, which is pretty cool. Um, and talks about his life, a little bit of history of him, and has a bunch of his writings in here. So it's pretty cool. Direct quotes from him. It has quotes of him talking about St. Polycarp, his teachings, what St. Polycarp taught him, which is pretty darn cool. Again, remember, St. Polycarp was taught by St. John himself. So anyways, I have yet to read this. I need to read this. Again, it's on my bookshelf. I have a bunch of books I need to read that are in line to be read. But he has his writings against the Gnostics. He talks about Saint Irenaeus also talks about why Saint John, like why the apostles, the gospel writers. Saint Irenaeus talks about why Saint Matthew wrote his gospel, why Saint Mark wrote his gospel, why Saint Luke wrote his gospel, and why Saint John wrote his gospel. It's pretty cool. He actually explains that. Let me see here. I thought I might even come across that section. Hold on just a second. Let me see if I can find it. It's pretty cool. Here we go. It says Irenaeus. Sorry, I'll go back to. So Irenaeus must have known the other gospels, right? The false gospels had begun making their rounds. Well, already there was a Gospel of Thomas, a Gospel of Nicodemus, and other such books attributed to as a Gospel of Andrew, a Gospel of Philip, a Gospel of Bartholomew, a Gospel of Matthias. That these false chronicles had not in truth been composed by apostolic men was, of course, a fact, but it was a fact which anyone other than a history scholar would simply have to take the church's word. But actually, he talks about them. So it's just interesting, which is pretty cool. Let's see here. Let's see if I can find it. Something I need to read later here. Let's see here. Well, might take a little while to find it, so I'll go ahead and get ready to end this video. But anyways, it's pretty cool. He writes about again why the different evangelists write their gospels. It's pretty awesome to do that. So, anyways, so I hope you enjoyed this video, this teaching, and again, it's fascinating to talk about the saints. I love the saints, and particularly the early church saints. So again, if you want to maybe like to read some of his writings, you can get this book called The Four Witnesses. So it'll be the writings of St. Clement of Rome. He was the third or fourth bishop of our fourth pope. Okay, you have Peter, Linus, Cletus, Clement. So he'd be the fourth pope. So the third after St. Peter himself. St. Clement was alive. He was pope around the 90s AD. Okay, so St. John the Evangelist is still alive. So we have some of his writings, original writings. He wrote letters to the Corinthians, which is interesting. You have St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians. You have St. Clement's letter to the Corinthians. You have St. Ignatius of Antioch. Here he has his writings. He was martyred around, like I said, 110 AD. St. Justin Martyr's writings and St. Irenaeus of Lyon's writings. So it's pretty cool. You get this book called The Four Witnesses. And that's pretty awesome. So anyways, definitely worth buying and getting and reading yourself. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. Again, my plan is to do, I should be able to do a Saint of the Week next Thursday. I will plan on it. I don't see any reason why not. I should be able to do that. So anyways, all right. Well, hope you enjoyed. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I'll be happy to do that. And again, next time, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat here. So. Okay. And for those who will watch this later on, Lord's blessing upon you, and have a wonderful night, okay? Let's end with a prayer. Lord Jesus Christ, we thank you for our study into the saints, especially the gift of Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, the gift of his life, and the great witness he was to the early church, for the writings he gave and his teaching. So we thank you, Lord, for all his witness to the world. And we thank you, Lord, for that, and his model of his passion for the faith and understanding the truth. So we ask you, Lord, help us to strive to do the same in our lifetime today, to strive to be saints and to know and love not only the scriptures, but also the faith, and to know and love you above all things. So we thank you, Lord, and we ask the intercession of St. Irenaeus to be upon us. So St. Irenaeus, pray for us. Amen. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. God bless you guys.